Take a moment to examine the color of your hand, whatever it happens to be. Whether it is light enough to be confused for a sheet of paper or deep enough to soak up sunlight the way a solar panel does. That coloring did not simply appear out of thin air. It is the result of one of the longest, most dramatic transformations in the entire history of life on this planet. And the surprising part is that none of it was random, none of it was accidental, and none of it came down to chance. It was a story of survival, a gradual biological back and forth between your ancestors and the sun. And the sun, it should be noted, was not exactly being fair about it. So what actually happened? The explanation touches on vitamin D, cancer, folate, Africa, ice ages, early farmers who unknowingly altered the course of their own evolution, and an indifferent star sitting 93 million miles away that set all of this in motion without a hint of remorse. If you follow the human family tree back far enough, you find that every single ancestor you have, no matter where your family comes from today, had dark skin. Not most of them, not the majority, but literally all of them. Roughly 300,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens first emerged in Africa, the entire species shared dark skin. There was no such thing as a pale person anywhere on Earth. Fair skin simply did not exist as a concept within the human species yet. Stop and consider that for a moment. Every person shown in a history book, every ancient culture, every myth, every cave painting, traces back to one original population that looked completely different from a large share of humans alive today, which means that somewhere along the way, something happened, something shifted, and that shift became so deeply written into our genetic code that it altered the physical appearance of entire populations spread across several continents over tens of thousands of years. So what caused it? Before answering that, we need to look at skin itself, because most people do not really understand what skin is or what it is doing for them at this very moment. Many people think of skin as nothing more than packaging, the covering that keeps everything inside your body while you go about your day. But skin is actually an organ, in fact your largest one, and it performs roughly 47 distinct functions at once, most of which go completely unnoticed and unappreciated. One of its most crucial jobs is shielding the body from ultraviolet radiation. UV radiation is the invisible energy constantly streaming from the sun toward Earth, and it is far from harmless. It breaks apart chemical bonds, damages DNA, and triggers mutations within cells. When enough of those mutations accumulate in the wrong spots over time, they can develop into cancer, specifically melanoma, one of the deadliest forms of skin cancer known. This is where skin pigmentation enters the picture. The pigment responsible for skin color is melanin, and in a very real biological sense, melanin functions as sunscreen, a natural filter that is always working to block UV rays. The greater the amount of melanin in the skin, the darker it appears, and the more effectively it prevents UV radiation from reaching the deeper tissue layers where your DNA resides. Dark skin is not simply an appearance, it is a form of protection. This explains why, in Africa, where our species began under some of the strongest UV exposure on the planet, evolution pushed strongly and quickly toward darker skin. More melanin meant better protection for DNA, a lower risk of accumulating cancerous mutations, and a greater chance of living a long, healthy life. Most importantly, from a purely evolutionary standpoint, it meant a greater chance of surviving long enough to reproduce and pass genes forward. Natural selection functions like a slow, unfeeling optimization process. It has no concern for looks, no opinions about attractiveness, and no particular vision for how humans should appear. It simply runs the same test again and again across billions of organisms. Does this characteristic help you live long enough to reproduce? If the answer is yes, it stays. If not, it fades away. In equatorial Africa, under intense sunlight, dark skin was consistently the answer, generation after generation. But here is where things take an unexpected turn. UV radiation does not just harm skin cells, it also targets something else inside the body. Something tiny and essential that, if destroyed at the wrong time in the wrong person, can end a pregnancy before it truly begins. That molecule is folate, a form of vitamin B9 that travels through the bloodstream performing critical maintenance functions. You might wonder why a vitamin would have anything to do with skin color, but it matters a great deal, particularly for anyone who is pregnant or trying to conceive. Folate plays a key role in forming the neural tube in developing embryos, the structure that later becomes the brain and spinal cord. Without enough folate during the earliest weeks of pregnancy, often before a woman even realizes she is pregnant, the neural tube may fail to close properly, leading to severe developmental issues or miscarriage. Here is the complication. UV radiation breaks down folate. When UV light penetrates the skin and reaches the bloodstream, it destroys folate molecules. In a place like equatorial Africa, with no clothing, no shelter, and no sunscreen, exposure to UV was constant and unavoidable. This created a second, powerful selection pressure. Pregnant women with less melanin allowed more UV to reach deeper layers, leading to greater folate loss, which increased the likelihood of neural tube defects, which in turn reduced the number of surviving offspring. So there were now two entirely separate reasons why dark skin was strongly favored in Africa. First, melanin shielded DNA from UV damage, lowering cancer risk. Second, melanin protected folate levels in pregnant women, supporting successful reproduction. Two different threats, addressed by one biological adaptation. In Africa, dark skin was not simply beneficial, it was essentially required for the species to survive. So dark skin appears to be an extremely effective, multi-purpose biological defense, tested and refined over hundreds of thousands of years. If evolution issued reviews, dark skin would earn a top rating with countless positive results behind it. So why, logically speaking, did it ever change? Why did populations that migrated out of Africa gradually develop lighter skin over thousands of years? The explanation is one of the most elegant and unforgiving trade-offs found anywhere in evolutionary biology. Sometime between roughly 70,000 and 100,000 years ago, groups of Homo sapiens began leaving Africa. This was not a single coordinated event. There was no announcement or organized migration. It happened through slow generational movement, with each group traveling a little farther than the one before. Over thousands of years, humans spread through the Middle East, into Europe, across Asia, and eventually into the Americas. As they moved farther north, something crucial about their surroundings changed. The strength of the sunlight decreased. The sun itself remained exactly as powerful and unchanging as ever, but at higher latitudes, sunlight strikes the Earth at a much shallower angle and passes through more atmosphere before reaching the surface. This filters out much of the UV radiation. Days grow shorter, winters stretch on in darkness, and skies stay overcast for long stretches. In places like Northern Europe, Northern Asia, and Canada, the UV environment is dramatically different from what exists near the equator. Instead of needing protection from intense, unrelenting radiation, populations now needed to absorb weak, inconsistent radiation as efficiently as possible. And suddenly, the dark skin that had been ideal in Africa became a liability, though not because of cancer, since UV levels at northern latitudes were far too low to pose much of that risk, and not because of folate either, since less UV meant less folate breakdown. The real issue was something else entirely, something that rarely gets enough attention in this story: vitamin D. Vitamin D is produced in the skin when UVB radiation interacts with a compound called 7-dehydrocholesterol. In effect, your skin behaves like a solar panel, using sunlight as fuel to manufacture this vital molecule. And vitamin D is anything but optional. It is absolutely essential to human health. It regulates how the body absorbs calcium and phosphorus in the gut. Without adequate vitamin D, calcium is not properly absorbed, no matter how much of it you consume. And without properly absorbed calcium, bones fail to mineralize correctly. In children, a severe lack of vitamin D leads to rickets, a condition that softens and deforms bones, bows the legs, flattens the skull, and stunts overall growth. In adult women, vitamin D deficiency can cause osteomalacia, a softening of the pelvic bones, which makes childbirth extremely dangerous and sometimes fatal. Women suffering from severe vitamin D deficiency faced significantly higher death rates during labor. But the effects of vitamin D deficiency extend well beyond the skeletal system. It also weakens immune function, increasing vulnerability to infection, affects muscle strength, and influences cardiovascular health. Some studies even connect chronic deficiency to depression and cognitive decline. Vitamin D contributes to so many bodily systems that running low on it causes multiple functions to break down at once. Now imagine a dark-skinned individual living in Northern Europe roughly 40,000 years ago. Their skin contains highly effective melanin that blocks UV radiation extremely well, a trait that served them perfectly in Africa. But in the dim, cloudy, low-light conditions of the north, that same melanin now blocks the very UV rays needed to produce vitamin D. The skin cannot distinguish between harmful UV that should be blocked and beneficial UV that is desperately needed. It simply blocks all of it. As a result, vitamin D production falls short, calcium absorption drops, bones weaken, children develop rickets, and women die during childbirth at higher rates. Over time, this leads to population decline. In northern regions, dark skin was not merely a disadvantage. In a world without supplements, fortified foods, or modern medicine, it amounted to a slow, generational death sentence. And evolution, ever patient and unsentimental, began working against it. Mutations that lowered melanin production appeared naturally within the population, as mutations always do at random. But rather than disappearing, these mutations spread because individuals with slightly lighter skin produced somewhat more vitamin D, had healthier bones, and experienced greater reproductive success. Generation after generation, skin tones grew a little lighter, then a little lighter still. Over thousands of years, the average skin color of northern populations gradually shifted. This was not the result of any conscious decision, cultural influence, or personal preference, but simply because, in that particular environment, at that particular latitude, with that particular level of sunlight, lighter skin allowed more people to survive. The underlying evolutionary formula had essentially flipped. For a long time, researchers believed that the loss of pigmentation among European populations occurred gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, a slow drift as people moved northward. However, recent analysis of ancient DNA has overturned that idea entirely and revealed something much more compelling. Early European hunter-gatherers, those who lived across Europe for tens of thousands of years following the initial migration out of Africa, remained noticeably dark-skinned. Even after residing at northern latitudes for a very long time, their skin had not significantly lightened. The most well-known example of this is a specimen referred to as Cheddar Man, who lived in what is now Britain roughly 10,000 years ago. Ancient DNA analysis published in 2018 indicated he most likely had dark to medium dark skin, curly dark hair, and blue eyes, a combination that seems almost contradictory by modern standards, since we tend to associate blue eyes with very pale skin. But 10,000 years ago, that association simply did not exist yet. The extremely fair skin now commonly seen among northwestern Europeans, the kind that burns after just 12 minutes in the summer sun, appears to have spread broadly across European populations only within the last 6,000 to 8,000 years. That is an astonishingly recent development. Within the full 300,000-year history of Homo sapiens, that represents less than the final 3% of that timeline. So what triggered this rapid acceleration around 6,000 to 8,000 years ago? The answer lies in one of the most significant shifts in human history, one whose impact on skin color is rarely discussed: the Neolithic Revolution, the shift from hunting and gathering to farming. When humans transitioned toward agriculture, their diets changed dramatically and permanently. Hunter-gatherers consumed a varied diet, naturally rich in vitamin D, including fatty fish such as salmon and mackerel, organ meats like liver and kidney, shellfish, and other animal products that rank among the richest natural sources of vitamin D. Farming populations, on the other hand, relied heavily on cereal crops such as wheat, barley, oats, and rye, meaning their diets consisted largely of carbohydrates. Their dietary intake of vitamin D did not just decrease, it collapsed almost entirely. Populations that had previously managed with moderate UV exposure, supplemented by diet, now had to depend almost completely on whatever vitamin D their skin alone could produce. And if their skin remained fairly dark, that amount was simply not sufficient. This intensified the selective pressure toward lighter skin considerably. Even small improvements in the skin's ability to produce vitamin D, even marginal reductions in melanin, became vital for survival. There was also a second factor that sped this transformation along. Farming communities tended to be large, densely populated, and settled in one place, and both the size and density of a population strongly influence how quickly a beneficial mutation can spread through a gene pool. Within a small, scattered hunter-gatherer group of around 50 individuals, it might take a very long time for an advantageous mutation to even reach a neighboring group. But within a farming village made up of hundreds of people, linked to a broader network of similar villages, a beneficial mutation could spread across thousands of descendants within just a handful of generations. The combination of collapsing dietary vitamin D and increasing population density essentially accelerated the process of European depigmentation dramatically. Within a few thousand years, the selective pressure that had been gradually nudging skin tones lighter over tens of thousands of years suddenly intensified, sped up, and became clearly visible in the archaeological record. Here is something that tends to surprise most people the first time they hear it. Skin color is not determined by a single gene. There is no dark skin gene competing against a light skin gene where one simply overrides the other. It is far more intricate than that. Skin pigmentation is what is known as a polygenic trait, controlled by dozens of different genes working together. These genes determine how much melanin is produced, what type of melanin is made, how it is distributed within skin cells, and how skin responds to ongoing EE exposure. What makes this even more remarkable is that different populations who independently developed lighter skin did not rely on identical genetic changes to get there. East Asians and Europeans both have noticeably lighter skin compared to equatorial Africans, yet the specific genetic variants responsible for lighter skin in East Asians are largely distinct from those responsible in Europeans. Both groups arrived at a similar physical outcome through entirely different genetic pathways, a phenomenon known as convergent evolution, where the same adaptive solution, lighter skin suited to low-of environments, is independently discovered through separate genetic routes by unrelated populations on different continents. Consider what that actually implies. The evolutionary pressure toward lighter skin in low-of regions was so strong and consistent that natural selection landed on the same solution multiple separate times. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly and independently. When evolution keeps arriving at the same answer from different starting points, that is about as strong a signal as biology can give that the trait in question is truly critical to survival. While still on the topic of genetics, there is another related and equally striking example worth mentioning: blue eyes. Every single person alive today with blue eyes, without exception, descends from one specific individual, one single mutation that occurred at one moment in time, somewhere near the Black Sea region, roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Before that person was born, every human on Earth had brown eyes, without exception, brown as far back as history goes. Then this one genetic change appeared, reducing melanin production specifically within the iris, and it began to spread, slowly at first, and then more rapidly, likely because it was genetically linked to skin pigmentation traits that were themselves under strong selective pressure at the time. Now consider that something as seemingly timeless and fundamental as blue eyes, a trait that has been used throughout history to categorize people, is actually younger than the invention of agriculture. It is younger than Stonehenge, and younger than the domestication of the horse. We often treat certain human characteristics as ancient and unchanging when, in geological or evolutionary terms, they are practically brand new. The version of humanity we consider standard and fixed is still very much a work in progress. Stepping back to take in the full picture, skin color, the very trait that has shaped so much of human history, influenced political systems, been used to justify terrible acts, and divided people into hierarchies for thousands of years, is, at its biological core, simply a system for regulating of exposure. It functions like a dial, an adjustment mechanism reflecting your body's best inherited estimate of how much sun protection is needed, based on the latitude your distant ancestors lived at, the food they ate, and the amount of sunlight they were exposed to. Lighter skin is not inherently superior in any objective sense. In equatorial regions, it is actually dangerous, allowing more UV penetration, more DNA damage, higher cancer risk, and greater folate destruction. In Africa, lighter skin would have been a clear survival disadvantage. Dark skin, meanwhile, is not primitive or less evolved. It is the original, ancestral condition, the baseline from which every other variation developed. If anything, lighter skin represents the newer adaptation, the variation that emerged later, while dark skin remains the default starting point. And perhaps the greatest irony in all of this is that the very same sun that pushed some populations to develop more melanin for protection also pushed other populations to reduce melanin in order to absorb more of its limited energy. The sun never favored one group over another. It never held any preference. It simply radiated indifferently, while evolution worked out the rest. In the end, humanity built centuries of prejudice, oppression, and social hierarchy around what was ultimately a vitamin D shortage, a calcium absorption issue, and a folate protection mechanism. Human populations continue to evolve even now, slowly and almost imperceptibly within a single lifetime, but evolving nonetheless. The same selective pressures that originally shaped skin color are still technically present in our environment, even though modern technology has softened their impact considerably. We now have vitamin D supplements, sunscreen, fortified foods, artificial lighting, heated homes, and year-round access to food from virtually every climate on Earth. We have effectively built a civilization that partially separates skin biology from its original evolutionary purpose. The process is still running in the background, but the conditions feeding into it have changed. What this means for the human species over the next 100,000 years is impossible to predict. Evolution does not announce its plans in advance. But what can be said with confidence is that every shade of human skin that exists today came from the very same original population standing under the African sun, gradually spreading across an unpredictable world, carrying within their melanin a detailed record of every environment their descendants passed through. Every skin tone is, in effect, a response to a question posed by a star, and every one of those responses turned out to be correct.